Friends, we have already heard Sri Shankaracharya's description of the nature of the gross and subtle bodies. We have seen how they come under the category of the not self because they are made of matter. Now we are ready to begin our study of the causal body, where he'll be showing us how even that is not self, anatma, because that too is made of matter, though extremely subtle matter. However, as we saw towards the end of our last class, before Shankaracharya takes up the topic of the causal body, he devotes two verses, 106 and 107, to the self, to the Atman, to the blissful aspect of the self. Because in the last verse, 105, there he said that the Atman is untouched by the happiness or misery experienced by the ego, that the Atman is bliss itself. And if you remember, that brought us to the subject of happiness and that all-important question of love. So let us quickly recall what we heard at the end of our last class. I was saying happiness or joy is of two kinds, relative and absolute. According to Vedanta, the relative happiness that the ego enjoys is only a particle, a fraction of the supreme bliss of the Atman expressing itself through a particular channel. Every form of worldly happiness that we know here, every form of such happiness is a manifestation of that supreme bliss coming through an earthly medium. On the relative plane, it is experienced when the senses come into contact with agreeable objects. That is why it is limited, impermanent. Absolute bliss is Atman alone. With this fact in the background, let us now ask ourselves, why do we love the things or people we love? What is it that makes us love them? A superficial answer would be, we love them because we think they are sources of happiness. But is this true? If it were true, if they were themselves sources of happiness, then we would have loved them for their own sake. We would have loved them as much as we love ourselves. But do we love them like that? No. Even a little reflection will reveal that we love them not for their sake, but for our own sake. We only love them as long as they give us happiness. We love our own selves first and foremost. So our love for things and people is secondary, and our love for ourselves is primary. Or to tell it frankly, our love for others is always conditional. What is the condition? They must give us happiness. But our love for ourselves is unconditional. No matter what we are, we love ourselves. But now, let us probe into this question a little deeper. Why do we love ourselves the most? What is it that we love most in ourselves? We've been discussing the anatman, not self, for some time now. Can this anatman part of our personality be loved for its own sake? That can't be. We can't love dead matter. But still, we do love our bodies. In fact, that is what we love most. So, what is it that makes us love ourselves the most? The Upanishad says it is the presence of the Atman, the sole conscious principle in our body. This is what makes us love ourselves the most. The very nature of this indwelling Atman is consciousness and bliss. And the presence of this conscious, blissful Atman is felt most immediately within one's own self, within one's own body and mind. That is why we love ourselves the most. It is the light of this Atman shining through the body and mind. And the pure bliss that is inherent in this Atman, it is this that is the real source of our attraction and love. In our present ignorance, we are not conscious of this, and we think we are bodies and that we love bodies, ours and others. But as we heard Swami Vivekananda say last week, what can really attract the soul? Only the spirit. Swamiji asks, do you think dead matter can truly attract the soul? It never did and never will. When you see a man going after a beautiful face, do you think that it is the handful of arranged material molecules that really attracts the man? Not at all. Behind those material particles, there must be and is the play of divine influence and divine love. The ignorant man doesn't know it. But yet, consciously or unconsciously, he is attracted by it and it alone. Then Swamiji says, even the lowest forms of attraction derive their power from the Atman itself. So, that is what we actually love in ourselves and in others. But because this is not yet a consciously realized fact, our lives don't reflect it. And that pure, natural attraction of the spirit for the spirit, that takes the form of worldly love. So, these are the facts. One, it is the Atman in ourselves and in others. It is the Atman that is the real object of love. Two, this Atman is, by its very nature, this Atman is pure consciousness and absolute bliss. We instinctively know that there is an utter absence of ignorance and suffering in the Atman. And it is this quality that makes it the object of our unconditional love. It is loved for its own sake. 3. The presence of this Atman is felt most immediately within ourselves. And that is why we love ourselves first and foremost. And finally, 4. Other objects or other persons are also dear to us because the same Atman manifests itself through them also. That means they are not loved for their own sake, but for the sake of the Atman in them. All in all, whatever is dear to us is dear only because of the Atman in them and for the sake of the Atman in us, and not because they are lovable in themselves. So this will be the background for our study of the following 2 verses, where Shankaracharya talks about the blissful nature of the indwelling Atman. So now we move on to verse 106, where Shankaracharya says, Atmarthatvena hi preyan vishayo na swatah priyah. Swata eva hi sarvesham atma priyatamo yatah tata atma sadanando nasya dukkham kadachana. Atmarthatvena hi preyan vishayo na swatah priyah. Swata eva hi sarvesham atma priyatamo yatah tata atma sadanando nasya dukkham kadachana. Objects of experience are dear for the sake of one's own self and not because they are lovable in themselves. The self, the Atman, is by its very nature the most beloved of all. Since the self is ever blissful, there can never be any suffering for it. But the question is, if it is true that the self is the most beloved of all, how is it that we are attracted by things and people outside us? Vedanta says that is what you think, that you are attracted by objects and persons. But the real source of attraction is not the object of or person itself. The real source of attraction is the Atman that is manifesting through them. It is the presence of the Atman in that object or person that makes them attractive, that makes them lovable. Only in your present ignorant condition, you are not aware of this fact. That is what Vedanta says. And then, why do we love these objects or persons? Atmarthatvena hi preyan vishayah. They are loved only for the sake of our own self. Nasvatah priyah. They are not dear by themselves. We have to understand this line very carefully. Here in the first line of the verse, the word Atma signifies the individual self, Jivatma, not the pure self or Shuddhatma. The pure self, as you know, the pure self is passive. It is neutral, transcendental. It has nothing to do with likes and dislikes. It is bliss itself. It is only the individualized self, the Jivatma, that has likes and dislikes. And it is for the satisfaction of this individualized self that we like, that we love things and people. This is what we read also in the Brihadaranyaka. There it says, really, it is not for the sake of the husband or wife or children or wealth that they are loved, but they are loved for the sake of the self. I repeat, it is not for the sake of the husband or wife or children or wealth that they are loved, but they are loved for the sake of the self. This is the fact. So, however much we may profess to love others, the truth is we love them only as long as they serve our purpose and no longer. Otherwise, how is it that what I liked yesterday, I don't like today? The object is the same, but our attraction, our love for it is not constant. Why? This can happen because of two reasons. Either my likings have changed, or the thing or person doesn't give me the same amount of joy always. But in either case, they don't serve my purpose anymore. So the truth is, our love for other objects is secondary. We love them as long as they contribute to the pleasure of our own self. Through love of the world, through love of earthly possessions, we find opportunities to love our own self. So, our love of ourself is primary. That is what the second line says. Svata eva hi sarvesham atma priyatamo yatah. The self, by its very nature, is the most beloved of all. Of course, this we all agree with. We don't love anything or anybody more than our own self. As we heard just now, our love for them is conditional, whereas our love for ourselves is unconditional. But what is it that makes the self so beloved? Vedanta says, you love your own self above everything else because this individual self, this Jivatma, carries within itself an image, a reflected image of the pure self, of the Shuddhatma. Let me say it once again. You love your own self because this Jivatma carries within itself an image, a reflected image of the Shuddhatma, which is all bliss, without a trace of suffering. It is that pure self within that we actually love in ourselves. Though in our present state it is not clear to us. This is the reason why we instinctively identify ourselves with this self. Of course, the same pure self dwells in all beings. The same pure self is the essence of all beings. And that is what we really love in others, true. But as I said, its presence is most immediately felt first within our own self. So that is why we love ourself first and foremost. Then, tata atma sadanando nasya dukkham kadachana. Since this self is ever blissful, there can never be any suffering in it. Now in this last line, here the word Atma clearly signifies the pure self. The blissful nature of this pure self is a self-established fact. Otherwise, we couldn't have loved it unconditionally. Nobody can love unconditionally anything that has even the slightest touch of pain or suffering. The happiness that comes from sense objects is subject to various conditions. So our love for them is also conditional. But the bliss of the Atman is not like that. It is the Atman's very nature. We can't but love the Atman spontaneously. So it is said that the very fact that we love the Atman unconditionally is an indication of its blissful nature. In fact, some commentators have analyzed the happiness that comes from outside objects, or the happiness that is thought to come from outside objects. According to them, what actually happens is this: real joy is undoubtedly only in the pure self. But it is not readily accessible to us because the mind is always restless, always disturbed by desire. Desires arising within the mind throw it into waves, and that cuts us off from the joy of the self. But when the mind gets the object of desire, these disturbing waves are pacified, for the time being, of course. And then, when the mind is stilled, the joy of the self shines forth. Mind you, the objects only still the waves of the minds. The joy comes from the self. In our lack of viveka, in our lack of discernment, however, we feel the self, we feel the happiness or joy comes from the object. But joy is not at all in the object. By quieting the mind, it brings me indirectly, it brings me in contact with the self, whose nature is joy. This is what Swami Vivekananda also says in his commentary on the second Yoga Sutra, Yogaschitta Vritti Nirodha. You can read it for yourselves. What he says in his commentary there is more or less the same thing. So, Atmarthatvena hi preyan vishayo na swatah priyah. Swata eva hi sarvesham atma priyatamo yatah tata atma sadanando nasya dukkham kadachana. Objects of experience are dear for the sake of one's own self, and not because they are lovable in themselves. The self, by its very nature, is the most beloved of all. Since the self is ever blissful, there can never be any suffering for it. But all said and done, do we have any clear evidence that the self is ever blissful? Any proof that clearly shows that the self is beyond all grief? That we spontaneously, unconditionally love our Atman always and above everything else? All that may be an indication of its blissful nature, but do we have any concrete proof? That brings us to the next verse, verse 107. Shankaracharya says, Yat sushuptau nirvishaya atmanando nubhuyate shruti pratyakshamaityam anumanancha jagrati. Yat sushuptau nirvishaya atmanando nubhuyate shruti pratyaksham aityam anumanancha jagrati. In profound sleep, when there is no object of experience, the bliss of the Atman is experienced. In profound sleep, when there is no object of experience, the bliss of the Atman is experienced. This is confirmed by our own experience as well as by the scriptures, tradition, and inference. Now, we had been discussing the gross and subtle bodies, the physical and mental objects related to them, and their respective fields of activity, the waking and dream states. The gross body and its objects. We don't experience them in the dream state. The subtle body and its objects, we don't experience in the dreamless state. And the causal body, which we are going to study a little later, the causal body with all its potencies and impressions latent in it, this causal body is transcended in samadhi. In samadhi, we have no awareness of this causal body. Objects of experience are Shabda, Sparsha, Rupa, Rasa, Gandha, sound, touch, form, taste, and smell. These objects of experience are present only in the waking and dream states. This we know. It is true that they are enjoyed in these two states, but the joy that they produce is neither pure nor permanent. That also we have already seen. But the Atman accompanies all these three states, and it is its bliss, the Atman's bliss, that is enjoyed in profound dreamless sleep. When there is a total absence of sense objects. And this bliss is far superior to the pleasures experienced in the waking and dream states. This is everybody's experience. Yat sushuptau nirvishaya atmanando anubhuyate. In profound sleep, when there is no object of experience, the bliss of the Atman is experienced, Shankaracharya says. Deep sleep is a state when all our sense organs and the mind have become perfectly still. There is no awareness of any objects, gross or subtle. That is why we call it nirvishaya, objectless. Sense objects, sound, touch, form, taste, smell, they are usually thought to be sources of joy. But in spite of their absence, everybody experiences the greatest bliss in sushupti, in profound sleep. This is a universal fact. There is not one soul who will deny this. We are always ready to go to bed and most reluctant to get out of it. How many preparations, how many arrangements we make so that we can sleep well. And the first thing we do when sleep breaks is check the time to see if we can sleep a few minutes more. Why? And then, if we are not sleeping well, we go see a doctor. But we don't go to a doctor asking how to reduce sleep. That itself shows how much we love sleep. Why? Because it is blissful. But where does this bliss come from? What is its source? It can't come from the sense organs or sense objects, because there are not any in that state. The body, senses, and mind are all asleep. Even the ego has subsided. So the source of this bliss has to be deeper within, in one's own self, in the Atman itself. If you leave out the body, senses, mind, and ego, then only the Atman remains. So it is the bliss of the Atman that we experience in deep sleep. And this bliss is said to be the highest because it is unmixed, unalloyed. All other forms of pleasure and happiness, joy, they're all a mixture of pleasure and pain, happiness and misery, joy and sorrow. It is Atmananda alone that is pure bliss, because it is its very nature. It is entirely independent of everything outside. It is because this unalloyed bliss is inherent in deep sleep. This pure bliss is the very nature of deep sleep. That is why we love sleep so much. That is why nobody can have enough of it. Nobody wants to be denied this bliss. We go crazy if we can't sleep. A billionaire can have all the sense enjoyments he wants. But even he can't do without sleep. The truth is, the more one enjoys, the more one suffers. But the more one experiences the bliss of the Atman, the more blissful one is. And luckily, this pure bliss is available to all equally on a daily basis, to king and pauper alike. So, speaking about the blissful state of deep sleep, the Brihadaranyaka says, this is the individual self's supreme attainment. This is its supreme glory. This is its highest world. This is its supreme bliss. More than this can't be said. And the Taittiriya Upanishad, there it says, this Atman is bliss. Who could have lived? Who could have breathed if this bliss did not exist in the space of the heart? Who could have lived and breathed if this bliss did not exist in the space of the heart? So now, we wanted to know what proof there was of the Atman's being pure bliss without even a tinge of pain. Shankaracharya says there is not one or two but 4 evidences of that. 4. Shruti pratyaksha-maitihyam anumanancha jagrati. It is confirmed by scripture, personal evidence, personal experience, tradition and inference. First, Shruti or scriptural evidence. This is given the greatest importance in Vedanta. And we just heard the 2 Upanishadic statements. There are plenty of other statements in the Vedas and Upanishads that speak of the blissful nature of the Atman. Then second is Pratyaksha, our own personal experience. This is the most powerful evidence. We can't deny our own experience. And this present verse, 107, this itself showed how it is everyone's personal experience that the Atman is ever blissful. And the third is Aitihya. Aitihya means tradition. They are records of experiences left behind by innumerable sages and mystics down the ages. All their experiences are preserved in Vedantic texts. And lastly, Anumana or inference. In fact, the previous verse, verse 106, is an example of Anumana. There we saw how logical reasoning also proves that the Atman is blissful by nature. So these are called the 4 important pramanas. Pramana means of valid knowledge. Scriptural authority, personal experience, tradition, or the words of realized souls, and finally, logical reasoning. Shankaracharya has now said, all 4 of them unanimously establish that the Atman is of the nature of bliss. So, yat sushuptau nirvishaya atmanando nubhuyate shruti pratyaksha-maitihya manumanancha jagrati. In profound sleep, when there is no object of experience, the bliss of the Atman is experienced. This is confirmed by our own experience as well as by the scriptures, tradition, and inference. So, these 2 verses on the ever blissful Atman, these 2 verses were a nice interlude, Zwischenspiel, after our study of the gross and subtle bodies. After this, Shankaracharya goes on to explain the causal body. The causal body is so called because it is the cause of the subtle and gross bodies. Karana Sharira. But before we take up the verses, I'd like to say a few words by way of introduction. We heard that the gross body is the seat of waking experience, and the subtle body is the seat of dream experience. In the same way, the causal body or Karana Sharira is the seat of deep sleep experience. The individual soul, the Jivatma, enjoys the external world through the gross body during the waking state. And it enjoys the internal world of dreams through the subtle body during the dream state. In the same way, it enjoys the bliss of the Atman during deep sleep. In deep sleep, all mental operations stop. There is no thought, no feeling, no imagination, no memories, nothing in the mind. The mind is not affected by pleasure or pain, love or hate, hope or fear. Normally, the mind is characterized by constant fluctuation. But in profound sleep, there is utter stillness. All its various features, all its various qualities, that is, ideas, tendencies, its goodnesses and badnesses, its merits and demerits. Merits and demerits are, in Sanskrit, they are called punya and papa. They are the moral and spiritual surplus and deficit. Everything merges in a state of complete passivity, a state of uniformity. The mind enters into a causal state in which all its functions lie dormant. All its properties remain latent. There is no cognition of anything. It's like a tree that exists in the seed, where all its diversities stay in potential form. In this state, the mind reaches the very base of the subtle body, so to say. And this is what is called the causal body, Karana Sharira. It underlies the Sukshma Sharira, the subtle body. From here, from the Karana level, the mind rises again in waking and dream states. In profound sleep, even the ego, even this ego which is always so ready to assert itself, even this ego disappears. That is why we lose our self-consciousness in deep sleep. We don't know whether we are male or female, young or old, rich or poor, pure or impure. We know nothing. So this is the state of profound sleep that is experienced by the individual soul through the causal body. When I, the experiencer of deep sleep, am covered by the causal body, what happens then? It is as if I face a blankness, so to say. I am in a state of complete non-cognition. All I am aware of is a general ignorance. This general ignorance, it is technically called unspecified ignorance. Not ignorance of anything specific, but just general ignorance. That is why when I wake up from sleep, from deep sleep when I wake up from deep sleep, I say, I slept happily. I did not know anything. I did not know anything. This is a fact of universal experience. It shows that in deep sleep, I don't actually lose consciousness. I remain as the cognizer of the causal body. I remain as the cognizer of the causal body whose nature is ignorance. Avidya, ajnana. I'm covered by ignorance. But the ignorance doesn't affect my self-luminosity. It doesn't do anything to my innate blissfulness. It only covers them, that's all. That is why I am vaguely aware of the existence of ignorance. I do say, I did not know anything. And my innate bliss, I experience, I say, I slept happily in deep sleep. Shankaracharya will be explaining this several verses later in verses 120 and 21. Then, as we wake up from deep sleep, the mind and the sense organs, with all their characteristics, re-emerge from the causal body. The ego consciousness is the first to rise, because it is from this ego consciousness, from here, that the functions of the mind and the organs start. Anyhow, it is this causal body that is known as the Anandamaya Kosha, the blissful sheath, because it emits the blissfulness of the self. That is why it is Anandamaya. And because it covers the self like a sheath, it is a kosha, Anandamaya Kosha. So let me repeat. During deep sleep, we are not only aware of unspecified ignorance, we also enjoy indefinite bliss. Not the happiness of this or that thing, but just pure bliss. This is proved by how we report on that deep sleep experience when we wake up. I slept happily and did not know anything. This is the nature of the causal body. Unspecified ignorance and indefinite bliss. And it is experienced in profound sleep. But we must understand all this carefully. The causal body is not intrinsically blissful. It is not blissful in itself. In deep sleep, what happens is all the activities, all the changes of the subtle body subside. And the bliss of the Atman finds expression faintly, because ignorance is still there. The bliss of the Atman finds faint expression through the causal body. That is how it is. But this bliss of deep sleep is far superior to the happiness that we enjoy in the waking and dream states. The happiness of those two states is derived from the experience of agreeable objects. When my organs come in contact with their respective objects, and that is mixed with pain. But the bliss of deep sleep comes directly from the Atman, and it is totally devoid of the pain and suffering that characterize the waking and dream states. So this, in brief, is the causal body. It is of the nature of ignorance and bliss. It is called the causal body, Karana Sharira, because it is the cause of the subtle and gross bodies. It's like the seed that contains the tree in potential form. And as ignorance, it covers the Atman like a sheath. So, this is the Karana Sharira and its nature. Now, first of all, we must understand the word ignorance correctly. We are not talking about ordinary ignorance here. We are talking about metaphysical ignorance. The ignorance that hides the reality and projects the illusory world of variety. This is metaphysical ignorance. Ignorance that hides reality and projects the illusion of variety. As you know, according to Vedanta, Brahman, Satchidananda, is the only reality, one without a second. Everything else is unreal, unsubstantial, and they are said to be products of ignorance. Vedanta philosophers use several different terms to describe this metaphysical ignorance. Maya, Prakriti, Ajnana, Avidya, Avyakta, Avyakrita, half a dozen of them. All these terms are used practically synonymously. Each of these terms, of course, has its own distinct philosophical connotation. But in actual practice, these distinctions are not always strictly maintained. Generally speaking, Maya signifies the cosmic illusion on account of which Brahman, pure consciousness, appears as the personal God or Ishvara. Prakriti is said to be matter or nature. It denotes the same Maya as the material out of which the universe has been created. That is Prakriti. Ajnana, ignorance. Ajnana makes the absolute appear as the relative, makes the one appear as the many. In that sense, it is Ajnana can mean false knowledge or wrong knowledge. Then we have Avidya, which is usually translated as nescience. That is also a kind of ignorance. It makes the Atman also pure consciousness. The Atman appear as the Jiva, the individualized self. Then comes Avyakta or unmanifested. The word signifies the causal state of the universe before and after two kalpas, in between two kalpas. And lastly, Avyakrita. Avyakrita means undifferentiated. This is again a primal condition in which everything remains in a state of complete uniformity, where differentiating factors like names and forms haven't yet developed. So we have these half a dozen words that have their own specific meanings, but which practically mean more or less the same thing. Maya means illusion. Prakriti means nature or matter. Ajnana means false or wrong knowledge. Avidya means absence of right knowledge. Avyakta means unmanifested. Avyakrita means undifferentiated. But as I said, the words are often interchanged. And then we have Shakti. All these six are personified as Shakti or cosmic energy. Is the power of Brahman by which Brahman as Ishvara projects, maintains and withdraws the universe. This is what the devotees worship as the Divine Mother. But then let's not go into too much detail, or we will we'll lose perspective. So now, this metaphysical ignorance, which Shankaracharya calls Maya in the following verses, this Maya has two aspects. It appears to us in two modes depending on how we look at it. One is the cosmic or the collective aspect, and the other is the individual aspect. From the collective standpoint, Maya or ignorance is one. But from the individual standpoint, it is many. It's like this. You can look at a number of trees from the collective standpoint. You can look at a number of trees and describe them as a wood. But you can also regard a wood from the standpoint of the trees and describe it as a number of trees. Or, from the collective standpoint, you may describe a body of water, say a lake. And from the individual standpoint, you may describe a lake as quantities of water. It's the same with collective Maya and individual Maya. But in either case, Maya hides the true nature of Brahman. The infinite and the eternal absolute appears as a finite being, limited by time and space. In association with the cosmic Maya, Brahman appears as the personal God, Ishvara. And in association with the individual Maya, Brahman appears as the Jiva, this individualized soul. So in this way, Maya becomes an upadhi, something that limits or seems to limit Brahman. An upadhi only seems to alter or limit the true nature of an object. But this limitation is only apparent. It is not real. This we shouldn't forget. Maya, whether it is cosmic Maya or individual Maya, Maya does not bring about any real change in Brahman. When Maya is overcome in the highest spiritual experience, both the personal God and the individual soul, both of them merge in Brahman and the three become one. Then Brahman alone exists. So, collective Maya is the upadhi of Ishvara, and individual Maya is the upadhi of the Jiva. The collective Maya consists of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, with whose help Ishvara creates the material universe. This is what it means when we say Ishvara, with the help of Prakriti, creates this material universe, because Prakriti is composed of these three, Sattva, Rajas, Tamas. And as you know, Prakriti is said to be the cause of this universe. This is why it is known as the causal body. It conceals Brahman like a sheath, but through it, the bliss of Brahman permeates Ishvara. So it is also called the Blissful Sheath, Anandamaya Kosha. At the time of cosmic dissolution, pralaya, when a time cycle comes to an end, then all gross and subtle beings merge in the cosmic Maya. So it is called the cosmic sleep, pralaya. It is this cosmic Maya that is the energy or power inherent in Ishvara. This is what we, as I said, this is what we worship as Shakti, energy. the Divine Mother. Anyhow, in the same way, from the individual Maya, the ego, mind, senses, and body of the Jiva, these are produced. So this is known as the causal body of the Jiva. During deep sleep, the gross and subtle bodies of the Jiva merge in the causal body. That is why the causal body is often designated as individual Maya, Vyashti Maya. In deep sleep, the individual Maya remains in an undifferentiated causal form. It also conceals the Atman like a sheath. But through it, again, the bliss of the Atman permeates the Jiva, the individual soul, in deep sleep, where there is no pain, no suffering experienced in the waking and dream states. That is why this is also called, on the individual level, this is also called the blissful sheath. So you see the parallels between cosmic Maya and individual Maya. The macrocosm and microcosm are built on the same plan, as Swami Vivekananda said. The individual Maya of the Jiva is not different from the cosmic Maya of Ishvara. The macrocosm and microcosm are really one and the same. There is no essential difference between a wood and the trees that constitute it. There is no essential difference between the lake and the quantities of water that constitute it. The difference lies only in how we look at them. So I think now we have sufficient background knowledge about Maya as the causal body. What we heard in the last 10-15 minutes may sound somewhat technical, but really it is not at all difficult to understand if you go over it once again or a couple of times if you want. I'm sure you will find everything quite clear. Then we will be fully ready to take up the verses from our next class. Thank you.